recent years have experienced substantial forest fires. There's an increasing number over time. It has an impact on public health and on the evacuees that have had to leave their homes. In 2023, your province had thousands of forest fires, which is far above the 150 average. And the surface area that was affected was 10 times bigger than what would normally occur. And the skies were smoke-filled for days on end, and folks had difficulty breathing. Now, Canada is a laggard on the world stage when it comes to our greenhouse gas emissions. Canada did sign the Paris Accord, and I imagine you are aware of the objectives under the Paris Accord. Now, how is it that we shouldn't make the big polluters pay, those that have a real bearing on our climate change? What's your game plan to deal with those big emitters, please?
Well, I would first of all say the average forest fires in Saskatchewan is 300, not 100 or 150. And we had 450 last year, and we experienced some rain that helped us out immensely. Alberta and northwestern British Columbia had a much more challenging year. Yes, climate change does impact weather, of which we're experiencing, I think, in fairness, all across the nation and around the world are experiencing to some degree. The Paris Accord, I'm very familiar with the Paris Accord, and in that accord, there are a number of opportunities, I think, for us to provide a platform. Let me back up. I don't agree that Canada is a climate laggard, and I certainly don't agree that Saskatchewan is a climate laggard. I think Saskatchewan and Canada are leaders when it comes to developing industries that are reducing emissions with innovation, and then sharing those around the world. And again, I said through the Paris Accord, there was Article 6, the internationally traded mitigation outcomes option, of which I would hope that this, and I would encourage this federal government to act on and to work collaboratively. For example, with the Saskatchewan agriculture industry, we're selling air drills all around the world. We'd love to be able to recapture some of those carbon credits back to our Canada and back to our nation and to our province, and ultimately to our agricultural industry and our innovators in that industry that are building some of the latest and greatest technology that are sequestering carbon in our soils, ultimately making Saskatchewan agriculture one of the most sustainable producers of food in the world, and marginally very, very close to being net zero today when you compile that with precision agriculture, when you compile that with the Tier 4 engines that Saskatchewan agriculture producers are paying for and utilizing in every piece of equipment they have. So Canada is not a climate laggard. Canada is an innovation leader when it comes to providing innovation to reduce emissions, whether it be from Saskatchewan's perspective, the ag industry, the potash industry, the uranium industry for clean nuclear power, or the oil industry. And so I think we need to look at this.
Premier, I'm sorry. I know that you like to speak. I know you like talking, Premier, but you haven't answered my question. Now, if you look at the figures, Premier, Canada is the second biggest greenhouse gas emitter. It's not me saying this. This is a UN report that has stated this. In 2016 and 2020, on average, we emitted 16 tonnes per inhabitant of greenhouse gas emissions. That's 4 times bigger than the global average. And we are a far cry from meeting the UN's climate objectives. How are you going to make the big polluters pay for what they are responsible for in terms of climate change? You circumvented the question, you waved your magic wand, and you think that with giant vacuum cleaners you're going to be able to sequester greenhouse gas emissions. But what about the people you represent? How are you going to protect them from climate change?
With all due respect, you're bouncing back between gross numbers of carbon emitted and then a per capita measurement, and you're not able to do that with any credibility with the question. The goal is not for the big climate polluters to pay. The goal is for them to reduce their emissions because they are employing people in your community and my community, with all due respect. Per capita emissions is the wrong metric to use, and I would encourage everyone at this committee and across government to not be using that metric. If you want to use that metric, Saskatchewan is the largest per capita exporter in Canada and one of the largest per capita exporters in the world. And so what we are producing, yes, it is emitting global emissions, but we are providing that food, fuel, and fertilizer, the cleanest food and fuel and fertilizer, to over 150 countries around the world, and we are displacing, in the case of potash fertilizer, for example, it's 50% lower in its carbon emissions per ton produced. We are displacing fertilizer that is being produced by Russia and Belarus today by making more Saskatchewan fertilizer available. Credit to the federal government that invested in the latest fertilizer, the latest potash mine that is being developed here, a $20 billion investment by a global company. And so the goal is not for our employers to pay more. The goal is for them to emit less and to displace higher emitting, like competing industries around the world. That is how we build a strong Canadian economy. That is how we lower global emissions. And that's how we employ Canadians in your community and mine.
Thanks. That is our time. We're now on to the 5 minutes rounds. Mr. Lawrence, please.
Thank you. And thank you, Premier, for coming here. And as a member of the Finance Committee, let me express my extreme disappointment with the chair unwilling to hear the representatives of over 1 million Canadians in the great province of Saskatchewan. I want to focus relatively narrowly, and that's with respect to the inflationary impact of the carbon tax. Tiff Macklin in Finance Committee made it quite clear that actually 0.6% of inflation, which equates to around 20 to 30% of inflation given the rate on a day, is the responsibility of the carbon tax, and that the increase will be responsible for another 0.15%, meaning that over 30% of inflation is a direct result of the carbon tax. Now, we've been unable to validate this until you took the actions that you did, Premier Moe. And I'm wondering, have you seen an impact and a reduction in inflation by Saskatchewan's actions with respect to the non-collection of the carbon tax on home heating?
The Statistics Canada, in their first report, it said, and I quote, in Saskatchewan, the collection of the carbon levy ceased in January 2024, contributing to the province's year-over-year price decline of natural gas. We're seeing it in Manitoba as well, where the province of Manitoba has foregone their fuel tax on the fuel that they sell each and every day. What you're seeing is the CPI is lowering in Manitoba as well. And so my question to this committee would be, if we were to lower, not increase, but to lower or eliminate what will be 17 cents per liter of fuel charged to all Canadians coming this Monday when they fuel their vehicle up to take their children to soccer, to hockey, or to whatever sport or school that they might be going to. What do you think that would do to our consumer price index across the nation? We'd likely achieve our 2%. We're at 2.7% now. And I think that would be positive, and it would give the Bank of Canada the opportunity, hopefully, to start to lower the interest rate, start to solidify that certainty for investment, both foreign and domestic, into Canadian communities and Canadian industries, which, again, I would allude to are the most sustainable in the world. The Saskatchewan story around the most sustainable food and fuel and fertilizer that we produce and provide to the world is Ontario has a parallel story. Quebec has a parallel story. This is a story that we told when we went to COP28 in Dubai. And this is a story that we would encourage each of you as federal members representing Canadians, all of us collectively representing all Canadians, to share at every opportunity. We are not climate laggards in this nation. We most certainly are innovators and leaders when it comes to addressing the challenges that we might face globally.
Thank you, Premier Moe. So just to summarize, and I'll pass over to my colleague, is that in the Bank of Canada, Tiff Macklin, the Governor of the Bank of Canada, said that we would see a reduction in inflation. And we've actually seen that in the province of Saskatchewan, as the rate nationally is 2.7, and the current rate in Saskatchewan is 1.7%. So we've had this validated, which, as you said, if the lower inflation means the lower interest rates go, which means we have more investments, which can enhance our productivity, which can make all Canadians more prosperous. I am just shocked that Liberals want to keep Canadians poor. Thank you.
The opportunity we have is to remove the consumer carbon tax on all things for everyone. That would reduce the inflationary effects that we're feeling when we fuel our vehicle up 17 cents a liter there. That same 17 cents a liter is being paid for the truck that is bringing that vehicle to our grocery store. And so, and the fellows that are producing it. And we see that in Saskatchewan as well, not with their direct fuel, but with some of the other fuel sources that they are using in transporting that food. So it is a challenge. And I think, as you can tell, I feel there is a much better way for us to work collaboratively, whether that be across party lines or across, subnational jurisdictions in the nation, if that may be, to really provide the Canadian way on leading the global conversation around climate change.
Perfect. Thank you, Premier Moe. Let me begin with pointing out comments that came from a sitting cabinet minister. Minister of Rural Economic of Canada, Goldie Hutchings. She suggests that a discussion that we'll have down the road when we know that this one is working. But I can tell you, Atlantic Caucus was vocal with what they've heard from their constituents, and perhaps they need to elect more Liberals in the prairie so that we can have the conversation as well. She directly linked the prospect of carbon tax carve-outs to voting Liberal. How, Premier Moe, has this changed your relationship with Ottawa, and has it given you and your prairie colleagues confidence that Ottawa is acting in good faith when it comes to the carbon tax?
In about 10 seconds, Mr. Moe, or Premier Moe, sorry.
Well, I don't think there are going to be very many more Liberals elected in Saskatchewan anytime soon. The fact of the matter is this is disappointing, but it does stack on a number of disappointing items. Listen, our relationship with the federal government is issues-based and policy-based. We don't agree with this policy, and we don't agree with those statements.
Thank you, Premier Moe. Thank you, Mrs. Cramp-Newman. Mr. Durin, welcome back to OGGO after a lengthy absence.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Premier Moe, as my father always taught me, when you point the finger, there's always three fingers pointing right back at you. And I know that you haven't reduced your provincial sales tax or removed the provincial sales tax on heating, but I don't want to get into that, but I know for a fact that hasn't been done. I know that you haven't reduced income taxes. I've looked at year 2023 and year 2024. It's the same. And I know that it's important to talk affordability, but we have to, if you're going to point the finger at us, I think it's important to recognize that you also need to do something. Now, yesterday, the Prime Minister asked you to come up with a credible plan that will respect our Paris Accord. And you've said something today, which I'm shocked, to be frank. You're against the clean fuel regulations. Do you have canola farmers in Saskatchewan?
Yeah, certainly. We have. We'd likely be one of the largest canola producing jurisdictions in the world, and are advancing that into ultimately climbing that value chain with canola oil. And significant investment, I would say, in canola oil manufacturing. The conversation around the carbon tax has been part of that investment challenge, I would say, but we are finding our ways through that.
Are you aware as to why they've made those such investments into Saskatchewan? And do you know why the Canola Growth Council, the Canola Council of Canada, Canola Growers of Canada were all supportive of the clean fuel standards? Do you understand that? Do you know why?
Because potentially they would use some of that oil to reduce the emissions in the gasoline that we are burning, or utilizing, that families are burning across Canada. And there is some of that conversation that is happening. However, I think there is a much more collaborative path forward on what will actually be achievable in this space. This is going to cause the cost of gasoline to go up for families. We are in the process as well at looking at, should we be a feedstock of transitioning really a food product to a fuel product for places that are already have the clean fuel standard in place, like California, for example. And so that is an ongoing conversation, not in all states throughout the U.S., but an ongoing conversation in Canada as well.
But in order to develop the local market, that clean fuel standard is the regulation that allows canola farmers to sell more products for fuels. That's an important policy. That's why they've been so supportive of this particular policy. Now, I want to go on to, you said you've participated to COP28. I'm assuming that you're in favor of international trade?
Yeah, absolutely. We trade with over 150 countries each and every year, export to them, provide them with food security and fuel security.
And I'm assuming that you're also aware that many countries across the world, whether it's Europe, the UK hasn't made this recent announcement. You know what a carbon import tariff is?
I am aware of what a carbon import tariff is.
So do you know what the impact, if Canada does not have a price on pollution, how devastating that would be for our farmers in Canada, in Saskatchewan?
I know that we have a federal government that should be engaging proudly on behalf of the industries that are employing not only Saskatchewan residents, which I would remind everyone are Canadians as well, but all Canadians with respect to what we are doing in our industries today. As I said, the Saskatchewan story is not only in Saskatchewan. Every province has a story about what they are doing, how they are reducing their emissions in the industries that are employing people, creating wealth. And I would ask respectfully our federal government and all of those involved to take that story abroad. That's what we did at COP28. And that's what we continue to do through our 10 trade offices, provincial trade offices that we have that work alongside our High Commission offices and our ambassador offices around the world, including one in London and one in Germany representing the European Union.
No, and I certainly support the work that Saskatchewan farmers are doing. I've been to their farms. They are innovators. The University of Saskatchewan is doing some great work in terms of being able to measure that particular output. But I'm afraid that if we don't put a price on pollution, then we are not going to be competitive in our exports market, because eventually what's going to happen is that jurisdictions that do not have a price on pollution will be slapped with an import tariff. I don't see how that could be advantageous to our Canadian farmers.
Yeah, I rival that concern with the federal government making these policy decisions that are going to put our national, and I would say our continental food and fuel security at risk. And that is exactly what we saw happen.
And that's why I'm pleading with you to come up with a regional plan that makes sense for Saskatchewan. Absolutely. If you want to exempt farmers, that's up to you, but a regional approach is much better than a federal approach. The Prime Minister asked you to come up with a plan, so I'm pleading with you, come up with a plan that makes sense for Saskatchewan farmers. Thank you.
We did.
Thanks. That is just past our time. Mrs. Vignola, go ahead for 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Well, thank you very much again, Mr. Chairperson. Now, earlier you said that the carbon exchange was perhaps not an effective initiative for Saskatchewan. It's just been great for Quebec for the past 25, 30 years. I could tell you about childcare, the anti-scab legislation, and a whole host of things. But that said, do you feel that Toronto's trade exchange is bad for Saskatchewan, the New York one, the Toronto one? And I'm trying to establish a link here with the carbon market. In a sense, it works in the same way, and it would make Saskatchewan bring in substantial amounts of money for both Saskatchewan and the federal government without hurting the rest of the economy, as you alluded to in your opening remarks. Are you against stock exchanges? Because stock exchanges do apply to Saskatchewan. Is it only the carbon exchange that you have a problem with and not stock exchanges per se?
No, and we have many companies here that not only, I would say, trade and are traded on, Toronto Stock Exchange, New York Stock Exchange. We have commodities in Chicago, but also globally. Many countries that are investing in Saskatchewan are on global stock exchanges as well, and that is a way for them to access capital, and we all know precisely what stock exchanges do. When it comes to the heavy emitter carbon space, we have a provincial plan in place for that. In fact, in many ways, worked with Alberta and led the nation alongside Alberta with the formation of a technology fund and working with our industries on what's achievable, when it's achievable, and ensuring that they are making the adequate investments to achieve lower emissions over time, ensuring that we are not putting forward unachievable targets.
Merci.
Thank you, Premier. My final question. You don't want a carbon exchange. You don't want a carbon tax. You're making investments to improve technology. But what solutions? We're trying to come up with solutions here. What solutions have you come up with that will enable Saskatchewan to reach its overall emissions targets when it comes to actually cutting back on greenhouse gas emissions?
I
Well,
apologize.
significant-
We're past our time. If you're able to offer up a brief response.
Significant solutions in the nuclear space when it comes to our electricity grid, significant solutions in trading through commerce, innovation in our ag industry, which I said is the most sustainable in the world. Same goes for oil, same goes for potash, and the opportunities through internationally traded mitigation outcomes to capitalize on trading carbon credits back and forth globally through that system. And so we have the Provincial Tech Fund. We have a fund set up that our industries can access to invest in reducing their carbon footprint, but I would say that they are doing so anyways on their own, and we continue to set targets with them through our our output-based emitter program, provincially put forward that we have here, and they're doing a very good job when we compare them to their global competitors.
Thank you very much. Mr. Boulris, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Premier, you've used arguments that we've heard bandied around about in the past, that i.e. that when we reduce pollution by unit of production, well, then we compare well with other countries such as Russia and Venezuela. But that's a red herring most of the time, because if we reduce pollution in that way by, say, 15%, and yet there's an increase of over 50% in overall pollution, well, the upshot of that is greenhouse gas emissions are up. And that is contributing to climate change, forest fires that are threatening your own communities. So reducing the density of pollution by unit of pollution doesn't really mean that much. Now, you said that the price on carbon is being borne by consumers and individuals. But what solution would you come up with when it comes to pricing carbon for companies and corporations?
We have that solution in place with our output-based heavy emitter fund. They pay into a tech fund, and they're able to access those dollars for investments in innovation. And like I said, they're going far above accessing just that fund for investments in innovation. They're making their own. I haven't put forward any arguments. I've put forward facts. When it comes to buying something globally, you'll have an ingredients list on the side of your box, and you'll have a price tag on it. I would say put a carbon content piece on that box as well. When you are purchasing oil that might be made in Saskatchewan and on your fuel pump, you should know that since 2015, we've reduced the emissions 65%. That's very real. If the rest of the world did that, global emissions down 25% overnight. If you're producing a granola bar or a wheat product or a canola oil product, 64% lower carbon in a Saskatchewan-based product, Saskatchewan-produced product versus somewhere else in the world. By buying that product, you are making the sustainable decision of buying a lower carbon product. The same is true when you buy potash fertilizer made in Saskatchewan. Not only would I say that it is very arguably more ethical than other places in the world, but it's had half the carbon content per ton. And you are doing right by providing that fertilizer for your farmers. You're doing right because it's cost competitive. It's it's a high grade quality, but it's the most sustainable product that you can buy in the world. And if you truly do care about the environment, you should buy your products from Saskatchewan, and I would say equally, you should buy them from Canada as well, because we are doing the right thing, whether it be in industries, whether it be in families, whether it be in communities. We are making every effort to reduce our footprints, and we're doing it and can do it without a federally imposed carbon tax, I would put forward.
Thank you, Premier Moe. Mr. Barlow, and then Ms. Atwin to finish. Mr. Barlow?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Premier, for being here. First, I want to, say congratulations on the economic output of your agriculture sector in Saskatchewan. I see it exceeded $2 billion in exports again last year. And I just want to put the numbers are quite staggering, as you talked about, in terms of the production from Saskatchewan and the impact it has not only on Saskatchewan economy, but Canada. When Saskatchewan exported 91% of Canada's chickpeas, 88% lentils, 80% of Canada's durum wheat, 67% of Canada's dry peas, and more than 50% of Canadian production of canola, barley, oats, and canola oil comes from Saskatchewan. When you see that kind of output, what impact does Saskatchewan's agriculture sector have not only on Saskatchewan's economy, but Canada's economy?
I just say you said $2 billion in exports. It's $20 billion in ag exports, $50 billion in total exports from Saskatchewan. And to Mr. Bullereese's question earlier, that makes us the highest per capita exporter in the nation. And we are exporting the most sustainable products that you can find on Earth. And so the carbon tax does have an impact on each of these industries, a very real impact. And I'd say an impact on the families and people that work in these very industries, as well, as we've discussed over the last period of time. But I would say that there's a larger problem looming when it comes to the investment attraction in order to, for us, and our goal is to continue to expand these industries out, to produce more of the sustainable goods that we produce for, make those available to the world. We need to attract investment to do that. When you look, for example, at primary agriculture production, you listed what we produce there, and it's the spinal cord of the Saskatchewan economy. Every community in this province is dependent on it in some way, directly or indirectly. When you look at the fertilizer cap that was being bantered about a while ago, that would reduce our production in this province by 20 to 30%. Why would we reduce production when in a world that needs food security and requires food security and is looking for food security? Why would we reduce the production of the most sustainable food that you can find on Earth and not look for ways to enhance that production and make it more available to Canadians, displacing some of the other food that's produced in other areas? Or better yet, take some of the innovation that we have in Saskatchewan, sell it through commerce, utilize our internationally trade mitigation outputs to capture those carbon credits back to Canada, Saskatchewan, and the ag industry so that they can reinvest in even more innovative opportunities to make sure that not only are we doing better when it comes to reducing our carbon footprint in food production, but we're sharing that technology, we're sharing that innovation with the world. We're doing this in India right now. The second last time I was in India, and our exports to India are up in the last while. Second last time in India, I stood on an air drill built in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, in a farmer's field just outside of Chandahar. They had sold 1,000 of those air drills. The latest technology in zero-till air drill technology that you can find on Earth is now being transferred through commerce to India. That's a good thing for the environment, and it's a good thing for the sustainability and food production in India.
Thanks, Premier. And I find this discussion we're having quite incredible when you talk about the environmental sustainability and successes that Saskatchewan farmers have put on, and yet you continue to be punished with carbon taxes and higher carbon taxes rather than being applauded for some of the accomplishments in innovation and precision agriculture in Saskatchewan. We know the numbers. Saskatchewan farmers paid $12 million last year in direct carbon taxes alone. When that carbon tax was up 23% on Monday, Saskatchewan farmers will be paying $15 million in direct carbon taxes to heat and cool their barns, dry their grain. That doesn't include the carbon tax they'll be paying on transportation, another $36 million just on the carbon tax from transporting commodities through rail. Premier, what is the economic impact on the sustainability of your farm families in Saskatchewan if they are continuing to absorb these higher carbon taxes?
Well, it will come home to roost in years where margins are thin. And we had certain areas of the province, as was noted earlier, that did experience drought, not just this year, but last year. We had some areas of the province that had record production. And so I would just say the successes that we're having we feel somewhat unrecognized. And I would say the industry feels they're unrecognized. And so we would ask all federal MPs, our federal government members on all sides to recognize what we're doing, not only in Saskatchewan agriculture and Saskatchewan industries, but recognize what Canadians collaboratively are doing in the various industries across. This cost is not helping. It isn't driving innovation. It most certainly isn't driving the investment environment that we need to ultimately drive that innovation that is going to make our industries more productive. In fact, the Bank of Canada has said just this past week that actually we have a productivity crisis. And I would say that we need to have another look. A very high-level look at how are we going to create that investment environment, because with that investment comes innovation. With that innovation comes industries with Canadians working in them all across this nation, whether it's manufacturing in Ontario or Quebec or natural resource production in the prairie provinces and into British Columbia as well, or all of the good things that happen in Atlantic Canada. We need to attract that investment, drive that innovation, and then look at how we can share that innovation with the world through commerce, yes, And that is ultimately the recipe for success for the manufacturing industry in Ontario and Quebec, is they are selling their cars, vehicles, not only to Canadians, but to other people around the world. And there's some of the latest technology
Premier Moe.
available.
Thanks, Premier Moe. We're now Ms. Houtman, please, for 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Premier Moe, for being with us today. I'm just going to begin by quoting the Supreme Court of Canada in their ruling around carbon pricing. Climate change is a threat of the highest order to the country, and indeed the world. The undisputed existence of a threat to the future of humanity cannot be ignored. A provincial failure to act directly threatens Canada as a whole. So, Premier Moe, you mentioned that you do believe we need to lower our carbon emissions. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And you took part in COP discussions. So do you support the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change?
We supported the work that was done with respect to tripling the nuclear footprint, Canada signing on to that agreement. We think that will go a long ways in reducing global emissions. We did not support the methane 75 announcement that came out at COP28 by our federal Minister of Environment. And those are about the only two discussions that we had alongside.
Is that why you sent a delegation of 60 members?
No, what we did was go to, unfortunately, tell the story that Canada didn't. And that was exactly what we're doing and how we're producing the products in Saskatchewan. I mentioned potash. I mentioned
okay, thank you. I'm just going to focus it back on Canada. Sorry to interrupt you, sir.
I'm looking nationally. This is why I went. This is why I went, is we went to tell the Saskatchewan story. We have a
sorry, sir. Yes, thank
in the
you.
Emirates. Yeah.
I need to.
It's a good story. You and I'll sit down and I'll share it with you one day.
Sure. So do you support Canada's commitment to the Paris Agreement then?
Certainly, in particular, Article 6, of which we would like to see some activity in Article 6.
And so, again, I'll point to a point that Ms. Vignola made, that just this week, 100 economists signed off in a letter in an attempt to dispel some of the main arguments of Mr. Poilievre and other opponents, including yourself. These economists say that a carbon price is actually the least costly way to lower emissions. So if you agree we need to lower emissions, and we're looking at affordability challenges for Canadians across the country, and this is the least costly way, what would you say to that?
It's not the least costly way in Saskatchewan, and a number of
so you
those
disagree with these economists?
A number of those economists are the very same economists that were appointed by your government to the Eco-Fiscal Commission back in 2016, when
so you disagree with the economists? Yes or no?
The last agreement that all Canadians,
I have
all
such a short period
Canadian
of time.
subnational leaders agreed on was in 2016. It was the Vancouver Declaration. That's the last
I have to ask another question.
Sure.
So you've also mentioned that you see the carbon levy as showing no measurable impact. So we actually have statistics from the Canadian Climate Institute findings that the carbon pricing system has actually helped lower emissions by about 8% currently, and we're on track to meet our targets. It accounts for about 30% of that emissions reductions plan. And so would you agree with their findings?
I would agree we could go much further with some collaboration around recognition of the investments in industries from coast to coast to coast in Canada.
I'm also going to focus on the rebate piece because, constituents in my community are certainly concerned about the environment, but they're also, faced with this affordability challenge. And so I'm going to look at some of the folks from your part of the world here. Alan from Saskatoon says the carbon rebate he gets 4 times a year from the federal government is crucial for his household budget. Without the funds, Alan, who is on disability assistance, says he'll have to scale back on spending for his everyday needs. Jermaine from Saskatoon says she relies on the carbon rebate for essentials, and while on disability assistance, the carbon rebate is a key part of her budget. Peter Gilmore, an advocate for the anti-poverty ministry in Regina, says those on low incomes rely on rebates to pay for essentials. Do you know how many people in Saskatchewan rely on these rebates to get by in the midst of an affordability crisis?
In general, they get less back than they pay.
Can you table some data to prove that for us, please,
It's
sir?
in the Parliamentary Budget Officer's report. Been quoted many times, and I can send you that, yes.
So you don't know how many people in Saskatchewan may be worse off if you cancel the carbon rebate?
Well, I talked to Kevin in Laloche, and he's quite concerned about it because he lives about 4 hours from his major center, a trip that he makes every week or 2 weeks at the least amount of time. I talked to Jamie, also up in the Laloche, Buffalo Narrows area, who is very much was challenged with the electric heat that he has in his home, of which the provincial government has made a move mirroring the federal government's decision on, but also living 3 to 4 hours away from a major center, a trip that he has to make often, both on the business side as well as a personal side with his family, and to get to work.
And I'll just end on the clean fuel regulation. So here in my province, we actually had our premier legislate an additional 8 cents on top of what New Brunswickers are paying at the pump with no justification for it. So would you plan to do a similar thing in Saskatchewan?
I'm not aware of what happened in that case in New Brunswick, so I can't say whether we would do a similar thing. But our overarching goal is to keep taxes as low as possible, in particular taxes that are ineffective, like the carbon tax.
And sir, would you agree that uncertainty around the price on pollution isn't good for businesses?
I would say that the price on pollution is creating uncertainty in the investment environment in Saskatchewan and Canada.
So you don't attribute any of the investments in our renewable energy sector or the new green economy to some of these policies from the federal government?
Listen, the economy that we have in Canada is not new. It may morph and move over time, but it's our Canadian economy. It's not a new economy, and we need to do everything we can to attract investment into it. And the carbon tax policy that was promised to be at cap out at $50, now $170, and who knows where now, combined with a number of other policies, are creating uncertainty for the investment environment. And I would say uncertainty that subnational leaders are trying to navigate through as best they can.
What kind of windfall would the oil and gas industry experience if the carbon levy was canceled?
There'd be no windfall. What you would see is a return to a significant investment into some of the cleanest oil and gas that is produced on Earth. And I think that would be a good thing for the globe.
That is our time. Actually, it's past our time. Thank you very much, Premier Moe, for sticking around. Colleagues, we're going to suspend for a few moments as we change the table and bring in Mr. Giroux and his team. We are suspended. welcome Mr. Giroux and Ms. Van der Wees and Ms. Griswold. Welcome back to OGGO. Do you have an opening statement, sir? The floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Good morning or good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. We're pleased to be here to discuss our report on the government's expenditure plan and main estimates for 2024-25, which was published on March 7, 2024. With me today, I have our lead analysts on the report, Jill Giswold and Caitlin Van der Wees. The government's main estimates for 2024-25 outline $449.2 billion in budgetary spending authorities. Parliament's approval is required for $191.6 billion. Statutory authorities total $257.6 billion. Consistent with previous estimates, money transferred to other levels of government, individuals, and other organizations account for most of the planned spending, totaling $283 billion. Notable areas of planned spending in these main estimates include $81.1 billion for elderly benefits, $52.1 billion, for the Canada Health Transfer, and $46.5 billion for interest payments on the public debt. I will now continue en français. Le budget principal.
The main estimates for 2024-2025 also represent reallocations of almost $2.3 billion made as part of the refocusing government spending exercise. Further details on these reallocations can be found in the 2024-25 departmental plans that were tabled with the main estimates on the 29th of February 2024. As the 2024 budget has not yet been tabled, the 2024-25 main estimates do not obviously include the new budget measures. As a result, budget authorities for 2024-2025 will increase based on funding requests expected to be made in the supplementary estimates. Caitlin, Jill and I would be pleased and happy to answer your questions about our analysis of the main estimates. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Giroux, and thank you, by the way, for sticking around. We'll start with Mr. Lawrence, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Giroux, and you've been in the press almost as much as Miss Taylor Swift, I think, in recent days, and with respect to your analysis of the carbon tax. And so I do want to just have a discussion of this, and so we can get some clarity on your report, because I think it's been as misreported and demagogued as it has been reported. So with respect to the financial impact, the total, which includes not only the fiscal but the economic tax and carbon tax impact, for the average family where the backstop applies, is there more money coming into Canadians' pockets or leaving their pockets?
So there's two elements to that question. If one looks at the fiscal impact, that is the amount of the carbon tax paid directly, indirectly, and the GST that applies on these embedded or direct carbon taxes paid minus the carbon rebate, most families are better off. We estimate around 80%. However, once we estimate also, we include the economic impacts of the introduction of a carbon tax, we find that these economic impacts of introducing a carbon tax, they'll have impacts on some sectors of the economy, the oil and gas sector, the transportation sector, for example, and investment income that will be slightly lower. Then we find that most Canadian families in provinces where the federal backstop regime is in place will see a small negative impact of the carbon tax.
So it for the average Canadian family, especially if we move forward into 2030, as this government is intent on increasing the carbon tax, we're going to see, because Canadians can't just opt out of the economic impact of the, so that, like, separating that, I understand why for sort of understanding it purposes, but the reality is that every Canadian is affected not only by the fiscal but the economic. So the net in 2030, Canadians will have, and now will have more money going out of their genes than coming into their genes.
Well, it's income growth that will be lower than it would otherwise have been. So that's what we refer to when we say a negative impact. It's not necessarily that their absolute level of income will go down, but the net impact is a reduction to a scenario where, compared to a scenario where there wouldn't be a carbon tax.
So if the carbon tax was canceled, Canadians would be, and everything else holds equal, Canadians would be wealthier.
Yes, they'd experience, on average, income growth that would be slightly faster than what will happen with a carbon tax.
Perfect.
But that presumes that there's nothing that replaces our carbon tax.
Perfect. And then I just want to move on to your, get into some of the specifics. So in page 3 in your recent carbon tax report, in table 2, you have an average of the fiscal impact, and then in Alberta you say the net cost is $2,773. In my province of Ontario, it's $1,820. So is that to say that the average family in Alberta would lose $2,773, and the Ontario family $1,820? That would be the cost of the carbon tax to their family or the household, as you say. Is that an accurate understanding, Mr. Giroux?
Well, that's compared to a scenario where there wouldn't be a carbon tax. So it's not necessarily losing, but it's lower growth or income growth than would otherwise be the case. So in that sense, yes, you can characterize it as losing compared to a scenario where there is no carbon tax.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Giroux. You've had one of the questions that has also been posed with respect to the fuel charge is the cost, the net fiscal and economic cost, greater than the rebate? Keeping it with the fiscal and the economic, is that greater than the rebate in all the provinces where the where the carbon backstop applies? My apologies, non-stop carbon.
That's the case for most income quintiles, except for those at the very in the bottom 20% of income quintiles. It varies by province, so it depends on the specific economic fabric and income distribution and household composition. But generally speaking,
one of the ways that I've heard referred to as a carbon tax is that it's sand or that is in the gears of the Canadian economy, and it's slowing our productivity. We saw Tiff Macklin come before this committee and saying it's adding a third of inflation, and Canada is facing, as the governor of Bank of Canada or deputy governor said, we are facing a productivity crisis, I should say. Do you believe that the reduction of the carbon tax would allow us to be more productive?
I'm not certain about that, because reducing the carbon tax or eliminating it would certainly have economic impacts, but I'm not convinced that it would do anything with respect to productivity. So it's not something that we have looked at, like the productivity impact of a carbon tax or not. I think there are many factors that come into play when determining productivity, and the productivity increases in productivity of specific sectors. So I wouldn't venture that far into the analysis.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kuzmirchuk, please.
Thank you kindly, Mr. Chair. And thank you again, Mr. Giroux, for being here with us today. Always enjoy your insights and enjoy the knowledge that you share with us. You've stated when you've done your analysis on carbon pricing, you said that we need to sort of look at the broad picture, and to sort of continue on the theme of Saskatchewan here today. Last year, you look at a report on the CBC. Last year in 2023, there were 494 fires that had burned about 1.9 million hectares. And the Saskatchewan Public Safety Agency, the Vice President, Steve Roberts, said that in his 25 years experience, he's never seen anything like it. And you look at in that same article, Colin Larocque, who's a professor at the University of Saskatchewan, has said, and I quote, "We had huge fires, astronomical numbers," and on that note, the Insurance Bureau of Canada stated that climate-related weather disasters cost insurers $3.1 billion in damage last year. $3.1 billion. Tell me, you've stated that your analysis doesn't consider the costs of climate change, the costs of doing nothing, which is what the Conservative members have put on the table, nothing to address climate change. Explain to us why you didn't look at the cost of climate change, which to me boggles the mind that you wouldn't include the cost of climate change. That is so obvious to anyone that sees the fires burning.
So that's an interesting question. And in fact, I'm glad that you're asking me because it's a question that gets raised very often. My mandate is to estimate the cost of government proposals. So the carbon tax is a government proposal. The cost of climate change is a relatively new area, and we have tried to estimate the cost of climate change under two scenarios where all the commitments are fully respected globally, as well as another scenario where only actions that have been implemented are in fact implemented, nothing more. And we find that there is a cost. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but there will be costs to climate change and over a long period of time. The thing to keep in mind, though, is that even like greenhouse gases, they've been emitted over decades, if not centuries, and it's a stock issue as much as it is a flow issue. So two issues to distinguish here. Even if the world was to stop emitting greenhouse gases today, there would still be global warming because the planet, according to climate scientists, has already warmed up. So if we were to stop emitting greenhouse gases, the forest fires that have presumably been attributed to climate change could continue. And it's not me saying that, it's climate scientists. So there's that issue that one has to keep in mind, even though there have been climate elements and climate events, climate-related events. So that the climate policies will prevent things from getting worse. But the point at which we are today, that's where we are.
It just with all due respect, and I really appreciate your analysis and the work that you and your team do. It's hard work, but it seems to me that you are only looking at one side of the ledger when it comes to this analysis. Mr. Giroux, is it fair to say you're really looking at
Mr.
one?
Mr. Kuzmirchuk, we lost you there for a bit. Do you mind starting just at the beginning, and I'll restart your time?
Sure.
Just that last statement.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like you're only looking on one side of the ledger. You're not weighing the costs of climate change here. Is it fair to say that your analysis is only looking at really one side of the ledger?
Analysis is typically a cost analysis, which is what I've been mandated by Parliament to do. So estimating the cost of proposals. If there is further analysis that is deemed feasible and required, I'm sure that there are lots of think tanks out there that are more than happy to do that analysis, looking at the cost-benefit analysis. And the government, if the government itself has cost-benefit analysis, I'm sure it would be more than happy to disclose that. To my knowledge, there hasn't been that much work undertaken on the cost-benefit analysis because it's a complicated field that requires lots of data spanning several years. So that's why, even though would be ideal to have the cost-benefit analysis, the benefits are always not very tangible and not easily measurable.
How much time, Chair?
We've got about a minute.
Okay, great. So because I take issue with your net analysis, I think it's incomplete, and I think it only looks at one side of the ledger. If we just look at the fuel charge impacts, directly, which you speak about as well too. And you talked about 8 out of 10 households being better off. Can you speak to that a little bit when you're just looking at the impact of the fuel charge and as compared to the Canada carbon rebate? You mentioned 8 out of 10 families are better off. Can you speak to that just on the fuel charge, not the net analysis?
So when we look at the impact of the fuel charge, the amount that households pay directly, so when they fill up the gas tank or when they heat their houses, and the embedded energy component of goods they buy or services they buy, we look at that and we compare that with the carbon rebate they get. We find that, roughly speaking, 4 out of 5 households are better off with a carbon tax and the rebate than without.
Thank you. That's very clear. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Mrs. Vignola, please, for 6.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Mr. Giroux, Ms. Vanderlis, Ms. Giswell, thank you very much for being back with us here again. You know, I have a great deal of admiration for the analytical work that you do. It's very precise, it's invaluable, it's really in-depth, and it's really hard work that you do. I really appreciate it greatly. Moreover, for the main estimates 2024-2025, the government didn't see fit to put its PDF document on its own website. So you'll forgive me for saying this, but we had to refer to a CSV format, which was completely illegible, or just look at it on the screen and take notes on a piece of paper. So congratulations to you for having been able to produce your report on time, given all of those constraints and difficulties. Now, the Canada Health Transfer will increase by $2.7 billion, apparently. This is a hypothesis, a supposition. The main estimates came out before the budget, which was announced, slated for the 16th of April, so everything could change. Now, let's say that there really is an increase of $2.7 billion and that the transfers will be for a total of over $50 billion, as you stated in your report. Now, were the government to meet the demands of premiers across Canada, i.e. to transfer 35% of their healthcare budget, well, what would the total healthcare transfers be? Do you have a sense? Unfortunately, I don't have the figures right here at my disposal, but a couple of years back, we did a study to estimate the share of the provincial expenditures in healthcare that was covered or offset by the Canada Health Transfer. And one of our findings that I recall quite well, in fact, is that the definition of healthcare per se had evolved over time in order to cover more services. And that, of course, it changes the total amount with a view to achieving a particular target. But unfortunately, I don't have the figures here. The main estimates that were tabled in late February, early March contains several $100 billion in spending, $449 billion, and the lion's share of that is transfers to the provinces, to organisations, and to Canadians and Quebecers. And there's $81 billion in elderly benefits in that total budgetary envelope. So what would the total of that particular transfer be were there not two categories or classes of seniors? For example, the 65 to 75-year-olds, had they gotten the same benefit as seniors over 75 years of age? Well, we don't have those figures right here at our disposal. And furthermore, it was perhaps in a previous report that we did take a closer look on those figures, but the seniors' benefits have increased to the tune of $9 billion in 2023-2024. and seniors' eligibility of 75 years and over was in fact broadened. Now, from a demographic standpoint, a lot of the old age security recipients between 65 and 75 years of age, well, the cost was probably roughly the same or slightly more, but I don't have the figures once again. Public debt is 10.4% of the budget. That's $46 odd billion. So about 10%, because the budget is a $450 billion budget. If the budget was smaller, then the proportion would be different. That goes without saying. Now, that debt rate, is that sound? Is it healthy? I know that we're already engaging in this process, but should we be sounding the alarm bells even louder and saying, stop, this is getting dangerous? Well, that's a sensitive issue to respond to in absolute terms. From an historical standpoint, if you go back to the 90s, there were debt servicing costs that required about a quarter of federal revenues, or a third rather, and that was alarming. It's far less alarming nowadays, given that proportion of federal revenue